Hello, this is Renn. Welcome to the podcast. I'm very excited about today's guest. I occasionally get invited to attend virtually a seminar at Columbia University. I went to one recently where this gentleman was a guest, blew me away, bought his book. It was great. I got to say, I got to get him on the show. And that is Musa al-Gharbi. He holds a PhD in sociology from Columbia University. He's an assistant professor in the School of Journalism and Communications at Stony Brook University and is the author of the new book, We Have Never Been Woke: Social Justice, Discourse, Inequality, and the Rise of a New Elite. It's from Princeton University Press, and there's a link to buy it in the show notes. Musa, thank you so much for joining me.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Loved the book. If I might borrow a little bit of internet slang, you make it rain red pills in that. And it's actually a great reference book. You've got so many references to studies in there. It's really incredible. And you've got a really interesting background. Now, you might say you're elite today. You have an Ivy League PhD. You're publishing with Princeton University Press. And you came from like a working class background. I think you came from a military family. Your first stop was community college. In fact, your story is really, really interesting. I'd almost love to just interview you about that, but I want to talk about the book. But there's one thing you mentioned. You were a PhD student at Columbia, and you said, hey, had a great stipend and all of that, and yet you had to work an outside job because you had a family to support. I think you had, two kids, married with two kids.
Yeah.
I think that's unusual, right? Isn't it, for a sociology PhD to have like a family? I'm curious how your like background and your experiences coming from that inform the work that you did in this book and elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's definitely true that even when I started, pursuing my bachelor's degree at University of Arizona, I was married, I had kids, I was a good 50% older than most of the other people in my classes. And in a way that was kind of disorienting or awkward or whatever, but then also in a way it was empowering because I already I didn't have to worry about dating and mating. I didn't have to, I had a pretty good sense at that point of kind of who I was and what I was about, and so that allowed me to kind of accomplish more kind of faster or whatever than I would have been if I was still in my kind of who am I, what do I want to be stage in my life. Right. And then also the fact that you have people depending on you, really people who look up to you, who need you to have your stuff together and whatever, makes it so that you can't really, I had a wild journey through academia that included getting canceled by Fox News and a whole bunch of other stuff. But like you can't just go, give up or or whatever. You have to keep finding some way to press forward because you have people who are depending on you. And then the last thing I'll say though is the fact that I was at Columbia and supporting the family probably did sensitize me in some ways to some of the class differences that I talk about in the book. So for instance, I mentioned how I had been, the thing I was doing before I moved to Columbia was I was selling shoes. I was selling shoes in the mall, and I was working as an adjunct instructor until I got canceled by Fox, and then I was just a shoe salesman. And so my graduate stipend at Columbia was more money than I had ever made, working full-time jobs in retail management and retail sales. And but a lot of my colleagues who received this same stipend to be a student, our job was student, looked at this money, which again was more than I had ever made, and were like, "This is trash money. This is an insult. This is ridiculous. What are you supposed to do with this?" And again, like if you're supporting a family of four in Manhattan, the stipend actually was tough to live on, and so I did work outside jobs the whole time. But if you're a single person, and in fact, I'll add, this is one of the things that was striking to me actually, was the fact that the students looked at this money as if it's just garbage, trash money, that it's not a real salary or whatever. Like a lot of the people who were working and living around them, the people delivering their packages, the people giving them pizza, the people, a lot of the people who were driving them around as Uber drivers and so on. A lot of these folks made the same amount as students, or probably in many cases less, for working real jobs, for like actually working.
Yeah.
And a lot of my peers looked at this money that we were getting paid to be students, getting paid to study what we like, with all of these other resources afforded to us and so on. And a lot of my peers looked at this opportunity, looked at the resources that were provided to us, and went, puh, garbage money, trash money, because they were comparing themselves to like full-on tenure-line professors at an Ivy League school and going, oh, I make less than those people. Well, of course you do.
Right.
And, anyway, so the fact that that a lot of my colleagues looked at this amount of money which we received, the package that we received, which was actually really generous and kind of extraordinary, and viewed it as kind of trash money, was something that was really striking to me, and that made me realize how different the background, the milieu I was operating in was from the milieu I came from. And then when I was a professor, when I was teaching classes at Columbia, I would sometimes tell students to write for the class that I taught called the social world. We would teach lessons about various topics, and I would tell the students to write ethnographic field notes describing something they observed in their life that relates to the themes of that week. And these memos were wild. I mean, I would have the students writing about, how they popped down to Paris for the weekend and popped back, or arguing with their mom about a $500 sweater or something like this. And again, I was like, oh, okay. I'm not in Kansas anymore, as Dorothy said.
No. We used to live on the Upper West Side, and my wife would be part of the Upper West Side Moms Facebook group, and people would ask questions like, "Does anybody know a good babysitter in Geneva?" And okay, great. That's not the kind of questions we're asking. But yeah, you obviously show great sensitivity to the working class people around this elite university environment that were often invisible to the students there. And I definitely see a concern that like animates some of the work. Well, you got a great title. We've Never Been Woke. How did you pick that, and what is the significance of it?
Yeah, so the title is a play on a book by a different sociologist, Bruno Latour, who has a book called We Have Never Been Modern. And in that book, Latour argues that the stories that contemporary people tell themselves about what sets them apart from everyone else, these narratives we tell actually obscure the nature of the modern world and make it difficult for us to properly understand, let alone address, the problems of modernity. And so in a similar way, this book argues that the stories that symbolic capitalists tell ourselves, that is, people who work in fields like consulting, tech, finance, education, law, human resources, and so on, the stories that these knowledge economy professionals tell ourselves about how we're allies for the marginalized and the disadvantaged, about how we're on the right side of history, and so on, these stories obscure from our view how various social problems come about and persist, who benefits from them and how, and interfere with our ability to actually address a lot of the social problems that we claim to be concerned with, and that I think indeed we are sincerely concerned with.
You mentioned symbolic capitalists. That's one of the core concepts in your book. I think your Substack is called Symbolic Capitalism, and I believe I also put a link to your Substack in the show notes. I'll verify that when I'm done. It's I signed up for that too, and you should. What is symbolic capital, or what are symbolic capitalists?
Yeah, so the idea of symbolic capital is cribbed from the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. And what he argued is symbolic capital are the resources that people draw on to make inequalities seem kind of normal or natural or appropriate. They're the kind of resources elites draw on to make inequalities seem natural. And he came up with three forms of symbolic capital. So there's academic capital, which is when you get other people to defer to you because of the credentials you hold or because of your association with an institution of knowledge production. So for instance, I have a PhD in cultural anthropology, or I am a professor at, Columbia University, or I write for the New York Times or whatever. So these are examples of academic capital. And then there's, so people take you more seriously, take your views more seriously, defer to you because of these credentials and associations. And then there's political capital, which is when you convince other people to defer to you, and to follow your plan, to do what you want, because you've persuaded them that it's in their best interest to do so, either because of the position you hold in an organization. For instance, I'm the manager, you should do what I say because I'm the manager. And if you don't, I'm going to write you up and so on. Or because you have cultivated a reputation as someone who gets things done or who knows what they're doing and who's really competent and so on. Okay. And then finally, there's cultural capital, which is when people do what you want, they defer to your preferences and priorities because they think you're interesting and cool and sophisticated, and they want to ingratiate themselves with you. They want you to like them. They want you to they want to make you happy, and so on and so forth. And so Bourdieu argued these three different forms of symbolic capital: academic, political, cultural, help mark people as being kind of insiders or outsiders, as geniuses or hacks, as people that you should listen to and defer to, or as people whose opinions and perspectives you can safely ignore. And in the book, I call this constellation of elites who work in professions like consulting, law, and finance, and so on. I call them symbolic capitalists because the primary way that we make a living and is based on what we know, who we know, and how we're known. That is, we make a living basically by producing and manipulating symbolic capital on behalf of ourselves and other people. And these elites have been known by other names, by other writers. They've also been called the professional managerial class, the creative class, class X, a lot of classy terms. In the book, I don't go into, it'd be kind of a side rant as far as like why I don't think it's actually super useful to analyze these folks as a class. I do talk about this in my Substack, but yeah, so symbolic capitalists is this elite formation of people who work in fields like who make a living by producing and manipulating symbols instead of providing physical goods and services to people.
One of the things you say is that the overproduction of these symbolic capitalist elites played a role in the emergence of the woke phenomenon. How did that play out?
Yeah. So one of the things that's really important to note about symbolic capitalists is that from the beginning of our professions, we've justified the, symbolic capitalists get paid much more than ordinary workers. We have a lot more autonomy than most other workers. We have a lot more social prestige than most other lines of work. And from the beginning of our professions, we've justified these things. We've said the reason you should give us this pay, this autonomy, this prestige is not for our own sake, but because if you give us these things, it will be to the benefit of everyone in society, especially the least among us. From the beginning of a lot of our professions, our professions have defined themselves in terms of altruism and the common good. So for instance, journalists are supposed to follow the truth wherever it leads and to be a voice for the voiceless. And academics are supposed to produce knowledge in objective ways without concern for anyone else's political interests or economic interests and so on and so forth. And so the fact that these institutions have been rooted in altruism and the common good has created a unique form of status competition within the symbolic professions, where people who are especially good at portraying themselves as advancing the will and interest, the will and interests of the public or of the marginalized and disadvantaged in society, are seen as being especially worthy of power and status and elite positions and so on, whereas people who are successfully portrayed as having the wrong motives or of having the wrong beliefs about the wrong kind of people and so on, they can find their position in these professions precarious or can even lose their jobs. And this has been true for a century now. It's not something that just started with Twitter. And so one of the things the book shows is that so this is a unique form of status competition that's been present with the symbolic professions from the jump. But during periods where things get really tight in the symbolic professions, where growing numbers of people who have a reasonable expectation to be able to get a job in these fields and so on find their position to be threatened or undermined, we tend to rely on social justice discourse even more to try to purge our rivals and make room for ourselves. And so there's this term you used, elite overproduction, is from Peter Turchin, a historian, and Jack Goldsmith. And what they argue, elite overproduction is the situation where society is producing more people that can reasonably expect to be elites than we have the capacity to give them the elite lifestyles they're expecting. So you have growing numbers of people who did everything right. They graduated from college. They even went to the right colleges. They studied the right things and so on. And they expected that after they did all of these things, they would be able to get a job at a good firm, and they'd be able to have a 6-figure salary and a wife and a house and so on. And they find themselves unable to live that life. When growing numbers of people find themselves in that kind of a situation, what they tend to do is indict the prevailing order that they think failed them and try to tear down some of the people who are successful, who have already established themselves, in order to make room for people like themselves. And so the book argues that when you look across these periods of awakening, this period of change, rapid change in how symbolic capitalists talk and think about social justice, we can see that this period of awakening that started after 2010 and peaked around 2021, it's actually a case of something. And there have been 3 previous periods of awakening in the 20th century. And by comparing and contrasting these cases, I show in chapter 2 of the book, we can get leverage on, like, why do these awakenings happen? Why do they end? Do they change anything? Do they influence each other? And so on. And on this point, when we look at the factors that hold across awakenings and tend to predict when they'll happen, one of the core predictors, the most consistent predictors, is elite overproduction. And the second key factor that helps predict awakenings is popular immiseration. And the second factor is important because elite overproduction, so when times are bad for elites, they're not necessarily bad for other people. In fact, my advisor, Seamus Khan, has this great, he calls it the counter-cyclical character of elites. So times that are good for elites tend to be kind of rough for normal workers, because elites have a lot more capacity to extract unfavorable working conditions for them and so on. And then on the flip side, times that are good for ordinary workers tend to be kind of lean for elites. And so the problem with this is then oftentimes when things are a little tough for elites, it's hard to get anyone to care. If things are tough for elites, but they're pretty good for everyone else, no one's breaking out their tiny violin to play a sad song about the poor elite who has to get a normal job and live a normal life like everyone else. But there are times when these trajectories get collapsed, when things have been kind of bad and growing worse for ordinary people for a while, and all of a sudden they're bad for a lot of elites too. And these are moments when awakenings are likely to happen, because you have these frustrated elites who want to indict the prevailing order and tear down some of the successful people to make room for people like themselves. And they have a lot more leverage over the system because there are large numbers of other Americans who also have a bone to pick with the people who are calling the shots, who also are really dissatisfied with the way things are going and so on. And so they don't just have a motive in these opportunities, they also have a means. And so the two big factors that predict awakenings in the book are elite overproduction and popular immiseration. When they're conjoined, awakenings become much more likely to occur.
It sounds like the woke phenomenon then is essentially in a generic sense, is in a period of unusually intense competition between symbolic elites for a limited number of slots, using sort of the patent of some ideology or moral justification as sort of a weapon.
Yeah, well, and one of the things I should emphasize is that actually, because symbolic capitalists trade heavily on things like status, this actually puts us in some ways in a more precarious position than other folks, because status, you can own wealth, but status is not something that's actually truly yours. It's something that's afforded to you by other people, and that you can lose at any time. And status, while wealth, you can have a situation where you can provide wealth to everyone, where everyone can have a decent standard of living and so on and so forth. status doesn't work quite that way. Status is much more closely like a zero-sum game. It's actually hard to give other people more attention, more deference, more whatever, without reducing the amount of deference and attention and stuff that you're giving to someone else or something else. It's a situation where everyone had the same status would be a situation where no one had any status. And so a lot of the and so within the symbolic professions, competition over elite positions or over symbolic capital and so on, it tends to much more closely approximate a zero-sum game than other forms of competition over opportunities and resources and things like that are. And so the kind of competition that we have in these fields is kind of qualitatively different than competition you'd see in other jobs over or in other contexts, better said, over resources and opportunities and things like that.
Yeah, you say this has been a recurring phenomenon since the dawn of the symbolic professions about 100 years ago. What would be an example of one of the previous awakenings that we could think about?
Yeah, so the last one was in the late 80s to early 90s. That was when we had the last big blowups around what they called political correctness at the time, but today we call wokeness. Then before the late 80s, early 90s, using a lot of the same empirical measures, again, that you can look to show that something changed after 2010. You can see that there was one in the late 80s, early 90s. There was one in the mid 60s to early 70s, which will maybe not surprise people. And then the one that's kind of neglected in a lot of these conversations, so there's also the first Great Awakening was in the 20s and early 30s. And that one also had pretty much all of the characteristics of contemporary awakenings in a way that people don't fully appreciate, I think. So for instance, a lot of the identitarian stuff goes back roughly a century. The first Great Awakening also corresponded with the first gay rights organizations, with the first wave of feminism, with the new Negro movement and anti-racist activity, and so on and so forth. And in fact, George Orwell, writing at the tail end of the first Great Awakening, has this book called The Road to Wigan Pier. I have a review of it on my Substack that I posted recently. And what I show in that post, and what you'll see in the book, is that a lot of these dynamics that define the symbolic professions, the weird ways that we engage in political struggles, the unusual intersectional nature of how we think about politics. So there's this great line in Wigan Pier, for instance, where Orwell says something like, it seems as if the ideas of communism and socialism, as if with magnetic force, draw to them every sex deviant, fruit juice drinker, vegetarian, and so on in England. They all get pulled in as if with magnetic force, and and what he argues in Wigan Pier is that a lot of these folks then focus on all of these weird niche causes to the exclusion of actually paying attention to class. They romanticize the working class and vulnerable, desperate people and so on, but they have absolutely no organic connection to those people, have absolutely no idea what those people want and actually think. And when they're confronted with the views of those people, they usually recoil in horror and immediately try to micromanage them and correct their erroneous. And so like all of these kinds of dynamics that we see playing out in the current Great Awakening actually go back a century. I mean, you can see them very clearly 100 years ago. And so this is one of the things that was actually the most striking and disturbing thing about writing this book, actually, is just how consistent these movements were. I'll give one last example. Mm-hmm. So Barbara Ehrenreich had this book that she wrote in the 90s called Fear of Falling. And in this book, she talks about how the way that student protests were received in the 90s was almost identical to the way that that protests were received in the 60s. And of course, reading this book in the 2010s, right, you can see that, again, the way things that, and I mean, like the scripts are almost identical. I include this long excerpt from Fear of Falling in chapter 2 of the book, just to drive this point home, just how striking the similarities were. In fact, in the 1960s, So I was working for an organization called Heterodox Academy,
Mm-hmm.
which was founded by a New York University professor, Jonathan Haidt, a psychology professor, with the goal of helping to improve viewpoint diversity in higher education and pushback against some liberal trends that were becoming more pronounced among scholars and so on. One of the things that's striking is in the 1960s, there was also an NYU professor who created an organization with academics across fields dedicated to a very similar mission, and so on and so forth. And so, like, I was reading these, as I was going through the historical archives and stuff, the parallels between the current moment and the previous episodes are really, really striking. There are some things that are different across episodes. I'd be happy to talk about that too. But the sheer level of overlap and similarity is like genuinely wild.
When I was reading the book, it made me think of sort of an ongoing research project I had was reading early 90s populist literature. And it's like, I always struck, this is exactly the same as we see today. As I said, I've seen this movie before and it was better the last time. Even stuff like, you talk about the debates over the, so-called critical race theory in public schools. If you go back and read like Arthur Schlesinger's Disuniting of America, it's the same thing, only it's Afrocentric curriculums, but it's really the same thing. I'm like, nothing has changed. Yeah. I feel like people are like, we have no context for understanding this. I thought that was great, the way you bring that to life.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. This is one of the, one of the things that's actually common in a lot of my work is this point about kind of extending the lens before and looking at whether or not things are, there's this assumption that's baked into a lot of scholarship and also journalism that basically runs from the premise that we live in extraordinary times and that nothing like this has ever happened before. And and we try to explain things that are happening today in terms of other things that are happening today. Right. And so this kind of aggressive presentist orientation that's common in a lot of social science and journalism really prevents us from understanding, I think, a lot of social phenomena very well, and also interferes with our ability to accurately predict how a lot of things are going to play out. So I'll give one quick example. This is not in the book, but I'll ask you a question and see. Yeah. So after Donald Trump was elected, there was this intense focus on foreign meddling because of Russia's influence in the 2016 election. And so a question that I ask people a lot, and that basically no one knows the answer to, is when was the last case of meddling of this nature in a U.S. presidential election? That is, when was the last time that a foreign power meddled in a U.S. presidential election to this extent? It was exposed, it was a big scandal, and so on and so forth. Do you know, would you happen to know?
That's a good question. I'm familiar with many of the revisionist column ideas about like World War I was British bankers and things like that, but I don't know. So I'm going to say that. Okay. I don't know for sure.
So you shouldn't. I do this all the time. Yeah. Literally, no one knows. But the answer is shocking. So basically, the last time that something like this happened was in 1996. So Bob Dole, the Republican nominee, was running on this campaign that was really aggressive towards China, portraying them as a big threat, as in need of containment, and so on. And so China decided to swing the election in favor of his rival, Bill Clinton. The plot was exposed. There was a lot of people who went to jail and were investigated. The Democratic National Committee had to return millions of dollars in ill-gotten funds. There was a major federal investigation. The person who was in charge of the investigation wanted to appoint an independent counsel like Mueller, but they were blocked at every turn by Clinton's Attorney General, Janet Reno, to the point where the person in charge of the meddling investigation resigned in protest. There were most of the public was deeply concerned about the extent to which Clinton might have been bought, because after the foreign meddling thing, he passed this series of sweeping trade deals and arms deals and other stuff like this that was really, really, radically changed the position of China in the global sphere. And this was a scandal that haunted Clinton basically his entire 4 years of his second term. But no one remembers it today. And what's wild about that is that the last foreign meddling scandal actually has deep ties to the current one. So the intended beneficiary, the intended target of the intended beneficiary of the last foreign meddling scandal, Bill Clinton, is actually married to the intended victim of the current of the latest one, Hillary Clinton. And in fact, you have people like Bill and Hillary Clinton going out in the media saying things like, well, you know, if a Democrat had been involved in a scandal like this, they'd already be impeached. And he knows that's a lie. Yeah. Because not only did something like this happen to a Democrat, it happened to him specifically, right. And he did not face impeachment charges for this at all. No. In fact, his scandal was worse in many respects. Again, the Attorney General blocked the investigation and so on and so forth. It was more scandalous. So he can go on television though and say like, oh, a Democrat could never do something like this, and people just nod along with this and no one points it out. Or you can have Hillary Clinton who says things like, well, you know, if Russia is going to meddle on behalf of Donald Trump, maybe China should throw their hat in the ring for the Democrats or something like that. She said something like that multiple times. And journalists were like, haha, funny joke. She's just being facetious, completely oblivious to the fact that China previously meddled in a U.S. election to the benefit of her husband. And so it's wild. But so when you take this, so I wrote an article pointing out this before. At that time, I didn't have the same platforms to major media outlets that I have today. So it's like one of my most criminally underappreciated articles. But the point is that, because so many of us operate under the assumption that we live in unprecedented times and things like this have never happened before, it interferes with our ability to understand kind of what's actually happening, why it's happening, and how stuff will actually play out. And if we're willing to scrutinize that assumption, if we're willing to take seriously the prospect that actually maybe stuff like this has happened before, maybe this isn't unusual, maybe we don't live in unprecedented times, we'd often be shocked to discover what we can learn. Right. And so that's, in a deep sense, that's part of what this book is trying to do. Is there's a lot of talk that something changed after 2010. There was a lot of talk about how it must be due to the features of kids these days or the creation of smartphones and things like this. And so I started by asking, well, actually, is this something that has happened before? And it turns out, well, yes, actually, it's happened multiple times before. Right. And if we can recognize that, we can get a lot more insight into why this stuff is happening and how things are likely to go downstream.
I want to ask about how you think things are going to play out, but first I want to highlight something that I think you go against what I would describe as the conventional wisdom explanation, which that you argue that we should mark the start of the Great Awakening to Occupy Wall Street in 2011. I think most people say some variation of this. Wokeness is how the corporate elites redirected this class-based energy of Occupy Wall Street towards ends that don't threaten them. So the idea is that Occupy Wall Street was the real class-based uprising, and wokeness was basically the way corporate America and these institutions defanged Occupy. Yeah. You say Occupy was really itself a woke phenomenon. I'm curious about that.
Yeah. Well, one thing that Occupy definitely wasn't actually was it wasn't a class-based movement under any meaningful understanding of class. So, for instance, take the popular refrain, "We are the 99%." As Richard Reeves emphasized correctly, to my mind, the idea that we are the 99% is really helps mystify, obscure how a lot of different social problems come about and persist and who benefits from them and how. It allows, we are the 99%, allows someone who makes really healthy six-figure salaries, but isn't in the top 1%, to look at themselves and go, oh, I'm just a little guy. I'm just an ordinary Joe, just like someone who's sweeping the floors. Me and the guy sweeping the floors are in the same boat. It's Jeff Bezos who's the problem.
Yeah.
And that's not really that's not really a class-based analysis. An analysis that would put someone who makes $250,000 a year and a janitor who works on a contingent contract sweeping the buildings in multiple sources as in a domestic outsourcing firm. A class analysis that would put both of those people in the same boat or on the same footing as part of the same bucket against someone like Elon Musk. That's not really a useful
right.
or valuable way of analyzing this. And more importantly, as Reeves and others showed, like if you focus on just the top 1%, you actually can't understand how a lot of social problems come about and persist and who benefits from them and how. So for instance, looking at wealth, the top 1% controlled 27% of America's wealth. That's a radically disproportionate amount, but it's not a majority, and it's not anywhere near a majority of America's wealth. If you only focus on the top 1%, you miss the vast majority of wealth in America and who has it and so on. Okay, what if you just zoom out a little bit? What if you look at the top 20%, which is to say the super elites and the upper middle class? Well, then you can account for 72% of America's wealth. That is, you can account for the vast majority of wealth in America. Another way of saying this is that the other 80% of Americans have to make do with 28% of America's wealth, and so on and so forth. And so if we only focus on the millionaires and the billionaires, we actually miss the vast majority of wealth. We miss the vast majority of what drives things like declining social mobility, rising inequality, and so on and so forth. And then finally, I think that's just really important to note. If you just look at the composition of Occupy Wall Street, setting aside the kind of the fact that they have these narratives that literally obscure actual class distinctions,
right.
Setting that aside, if you look at who took part in the protests and where the protests happened, they were almost exclusively concentrated in knowledge economy hubs. The people who took part in Occupy Wall Street were actually the exact same slice of America that took part in Black Lives Matter and Me Too and all of these other highly educated, relatively affluent people. There were very few working class people who took part in Occupy Wall Street. There were very few people with kind of non-symbolic capitalist jobs in Occupy Wall Street who took part in the Occupy movement. And when you look at the norms and stuff that governed, so like the Occupy protests were doggedly resistant to politics in any normal sense. Like they refused to have a platform or advance any particular policies. They had this kind of weird progressive stack way of governing meetings where you had these bizarre, like these kind of bizarre arcane rules, not arcane, these kind of bizarre bureaucratic rules about who gets to speak and in what order and under what circumstances. And this isn't the way that normie Americans,
right.
like when they organize social movements, they go, well, you know what we should do? We should come up with these really obscure bureaucratic rules to allocate status and whatever according to that's a kind of thing that we do. And it's only us who gets drawn to this kind of stuff. And in fact, these kinds of norms, like the progressive stack, tend to really alienate. If a working class person managed to stumble into an Occupy protest and wanted to just talk about the issues of the day or come up with some kind of a policy to address in a concrete way the kinds of problems they're facing, they would be told, actually, no, we don't enforce or even think about policy. And by the way, who said you could talk? You have to join them, right? And this is a kind of thing that that would like alienate. So from top to bottom, you know, when you look at the policies, when you look at who took part in them, when you look at the norms that prevailed, these were symbolic capitalist creations top to bottom, and they were exactly the same in terms of the dynamics within them and so on, as most of the identitarian protests that followed. And as I show in the book, you often see this kind of the same kind of thing that we saw in Occupy, where there's this kind of pseudo class-based thing that eventually gives way to this kind of weird niche identitarian stuff. That's a thing that plays out across the book. As in fact, I just mentioned this in this 1920s book by George Orwell. He describes how this played out at length, how these ostensibly socialist and communist movements were subsumed by this kind of weird niche stuff around all these other kind of identitarian weird kind of things in a way that alienated working people and ultimately killed. So this is a thing that happens time after time after time. Yeah, and so for the purposes of analyzing the contemporary awakening, as I argue in chapter 2, yeah, I absolutely think it's, if you wanted to look at when the awakening began, a kind of a good starting point for the current awakening, I would say Occupy Wall Street is as good as you can get.
Well, that's the beginning. How does this end? What's the end game for wokeness? How do you see this playing out, I guess, in the coming years or however long it will take?
So so what I argue in the book is that these factors that drive awakenings, elite overproduction and popular immiseration, as one or more of these factors tends to ease, the awakenings tend to fizzle out. They fizzle out in part because as popular immiseration or elite overproduction eases, then a lot of the motives that drove people to take part in these movements, they just move on with their lives, and instead of continuing to protest. And then also, though, these coalitions that symbolic capitalists try to make between themselves and normies, or themselves and genuinely disadvantaged and marginalized people, and so on, these alliances often prove unstable. They prove unstable for two reasons. One, because what symbolic capitalists really want to be at the end of the day is elites. And this becomes really clear to basically everyone over time in ways that interfere with movement building and solidarity and things like this. And then two, symbolic capitalists also tend to have these really funky ways of thinking and talking about politics that, again, alienate a lot of the other people that they are trying to be in coalition with. And so these coalitions that we try to create during these periods of awakening tend to be unstable in general. And so the combination of this internal instability and the easing crises that helped fuel the awakenings tends to lead them to just and so what we can see when we look at the empirical measures that show something changed after 2010 is we can see that after 2021 something seems to have changed again, where a lot of these empirical measures seem to have peaked around 2021 and are now on the downswing. They're still higher. Most of these measures are still at an elevated place relative to where they were before they started so we're not back to 2009 or something like that, but the downswing is clear, and will probably continue for a little while. And one of the things that happens towards the tail end of the awakenings, in addition to the fact that symbolic capitalists tend to moderate as either, again, the elite overproduction thing eases, or just as other people get fed up with us and stop listening to us and so on. But then also, awakenings tend to be followed by backlash against our institutions and by right-aligned gains at the ballot box. And this happens for the reason this happens, and this is happening now. It's kind of very clear in the 2024 election. On the Substack, I wrote something that emphasizes this point, that what you can see when you look at the 2024 election and its outcome, and in fact, in every midterm and general election since 2010, for that matter, is consistent attrition among people who are sociologically distant from symbolic capitalists. They've been leaving the Democratic Party in ever bigger numbers, whereas the kind of people who do join the symbolic professions have been growing more and more firmly aligned with the Democratic Party. And the reason you see this kind of backlash is because even under ordinary times, symbolic capitalists tend to talk and think about politics, as I said, in kind of funky ways. During these periods of awakening, the gap between us and everyone else gets a lot bigger because we shift a lot. Whereas most of the rest of the public, though, they don't shift much. And so the gap between us and other people grows. And we tend to perceive this gap growing as well. And our story for why the gap grows is because those people must be growing more racist, more sexist, more misogynistic, and so on. But when you actually look at the data, in fact, often typically data that we ourselves produce, we're the ones who collect and produce this data. If we pay attention to our own data and analyze it, we can see that actually it's not the case that ordinary Americans are growing more racist or sexist or misogynistic or transphobic or anything like that. In fact, there's this kind of trend line in public attitudes that moves in a pretty progressive direction consistently across most of these issue domains that's completely independent of the awakenings. The awakenings have no effect on it one way or the other. The reason the gap grows is because we shift a lot. Okay, so not only does the gap grow during these periods of awakening, it also becomes more salient in people's minds. Because during these periods, we become a lot more militant about confronting and mocking and demonizing and trying to censor and smear anyone who disagrees with us. We become a lot more intolerant of dissent. And so even as the gap is growing bigger, people pay more attention to it and they care about it more. And this creates an opportunity for political entrepreneurs, usually associated with the right, with the political right, to basically campaign on bringing people like us back under control. Narratives like, higher ed institutions are indoctrinating the young people instead of teaching them useful knowledge and skills. We have to bring these tenured radicals under control. Or media outlets have become a propaganda arm for the Democratic Party rather than telling you the truth. These kinds of narratives become popular in the aftermath of each of the awakenings, and often lead to the creation, I'll say, of alternative knowledge economy institutions like Fox News or think tanks, or in this case, Truth Social and Parler, and so on and so forth. And they also lead to the ways that we conduct ourselves, the alienating ways that we conduct ourselves during these periods of awakening, also tend to lead to kind of durably reduced trust in our institutions in many cases as well. And so this period of backlash that we're in right now, where you're seeing these kind of gains by right-aligned folks, you're seeing this pressure being put on institutions of higher learning and other knowledge economy institutions through legislatures around the country and so on, where you're seeing this kind of reduced trust in institutions. These are all things that play out pretty much in very similar ways in the aftermath of each of these periods of awakening, and that will probably continue in the short to medium term as well as the awakening is winding down. But then eventually the anti-awakenings also run out of steam because people across the board other than us eventually get bored of the culture wars and want to return to some kind of and so I think in the short to medium term, this kind of this period of anti-awakening that we're in will continue, but it'll also fizzle out eventually.
Yeah, well, I could ask a ton more questions. There's so much in this book that we didn't even talk about, like why all these symbolic elites like to portray themselves as victims, the fact that these tend to be mostly white people, the fact that this elite overproduction now is disproportionately women, totemic capital. There are a ton of great things in this that actually are very, very, very interesting, and you get tons of good data in it. But I will actually leave that for you to buy the book. Again, the book is called We Have Never Been Woke: Social Justice, Discourse, Inequality, and the Rise of a New Elite by Musa al-Gharbi, who's been my guest today. Be sure to check it out. There's a link to buy it in the show notes. Musa, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for having me.